Good afternoon, and welcome to the launch of Wilson Global Fellow Bradley Jardine's new report, Great Wall of Steel, China's Global Campaign to Suppress the Uyghurs. My name is Robert Daly. I direct the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at Wilson. And we've been delighted to work with Bradley over the past 2 years to support his research on a number of fronts and to make today's report possible. Bradley Jardine is not only a global fellow here at Wilson, affiliated with both the Kissinger Institute on China and the Kennan Institute on Russia. He is also a former Schwarzman Fellow. In fact, he came to Wilson from Schwarzman College in Beijing. He has also served as editor of the Moscow Times from 2016 to 2017, and was the South Caucasus correspondent for EurasiaNet from 2017 to 2018. Bradley has a master's in Russian and Eurasian studies from the University of Glasgow and a master's in global affairs from Tsinghua University in Beijing. He is also the director of research at the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs. Bradley, it's just been a pleasure to have you with us at Wilson, and we're very glad now that your work can be shown to the rest of the world. I've asked Bradley to first introduce his report, to take about 20 minutes to do so. And when he is done, we are very honored to have two distinguished discussants. Mr. Omar Kanat is the chairman of the executive committee of the World Uyghur Congress. He also helped to found the Uyghur Human Rights Project in 2003 and was also a founder of the World Uyghur Youth Congress, where he served 2 terms as president from 1996 to 2000. And he has been a leading voice and proponent for Uyghurs around the world and within China for many years, and is doubtless known to many people on today's call. We will also be joined by Nuri Turkel, who is a lawyer and foreign policy expert, and who, since June of 2021, has served as vice chair of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, a post that he was appointed to by Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives. In September of 2020, Nuri Turkel was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. And in May 2021, he was named to Fortune's list of the world's 50 greatest leaders. And we're honored both to have Mr. Kanat and Mr. Turkel with us to comment on Bradley's work and the many issues that it raises. After their discussion, we will welcome questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please send it to us at china@wilsoncenter.org. Again, it's china@wilsoncenter.org. Thank you for joining us. Bradley, congratulations. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Robert. So we're here to talk about the report, Great Wall of Steel, China's global campaign to suppress the Uyghurs. What this report does is it advances our discussion on the atrocities that are taking place within Xinjiang's borders and frames it within our global context. The framework I've used for this report is a growing term known as transnational repression. Of course, China is not unique in its use of transnational repression, meaning the strategies by which authoritarian states pursue regime critics, dissidents, and diaspora figures abroad and overseas. Many other regimes do this, including Russia, Iran, North Korea. Rwanda is a major proponent of these strategies. Other organizations have focused on this term, including Freedom House, who has been documenting hundreds of cases by each of these countries, including China. But this is one of the first major quantitative studies looking at a huge data set, which I've been working on for the past 2 years, in partnership with the Uyghur Human Rights Project and with the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs, and of course with the Wilson Center. This report advances that discussion and expands on the existing data set. So by transnational repression, we're really looking at the ways in which China is targeting the Uyghurs. What's unique about this case, unlike other regimes that use transnational repression, is often prominent figures, political activists are targeted. But since 2017, with the mass internment program that's been unfolding within Xinjiang, we've really seen China targeting even ordinary Uyghurs who are apolitical. which has really made this scale of the abuse of international systems quite unprecedented. So one of the reasons for this is, of course, the mass internment program itself. This has granted China significant leverage over family members of many people who are residing overseas in safer jurisdictions, including the United States. So these Uyghurs who are active there or have engaged in political rallies or any form of discussion with media, they've soon found that their relatives who are detained in the re-education centers have had pressure placed on them, and they've received threatening messages from Chinese security officials over telecoms channels, especially with WeChat, which is a prominent Chinese messaging service, which many Uyghur diaspora community activists rely on to communicate with their family back home. It's one of the only modes available through which they can communicate. So this has granted substantial leverage to China. Another aspect that's unique in the Chinese case is just the sheer scale of China's global integration with the world economy, the massive economic and political influence it wields around the world, particularly in adjacent regions with Xinjiang, such as South Asia and Central Asia, which is really where transnational repression of the Chinese state against the Uyghurs began. In addition to that, we really look at the interplay of how domestic factors within China, especially regime insecurity perceptions, have really influenced its policies in different parts of the world. So taking this quantitative study, I look at the evolution of China's transnational repression over 3 distinct periods. The first is following the initial collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, throughout from the 1960s onwards, with the Sino-Soviet split, the border with Soviet Central Asia and what we know as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region was essentially sealed off from one another. There are very little cultural linkages between the large Uyghur diaspora residing in Central Asia. It's still to this day the largest Uyghur diaspora community, and the Uyghur population of Xinjiang. So in the early years, China worked to build and establish what is known today as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This was initially a multilateral framework for consolidating borders. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of independent Turkic states, the Central Asian republics today, which have a lot of cultural links with the Uyghur population across the border. So part of it was established to consolidate those borders. The other was to establish economic, political ties with the emerging region, especially to develop China's inner heartland provinces, including Xinjiang, Tibet, and sparsely populated regions, rather than the coastal development strategies that China had been focusing on for the decade prior. But over time, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization also advanced what is known as the 3 evils. So this is of extremism, separatism, and really what this has done is it's done a consolidation of China's rhetorical use of war on terror methods. This is another aspect where really we've seen global changes in policies toward Muslims with targeting of Islam really since the war on terror. China seized on this rhetoric, and it really used the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to pursue this by labeling what had previously termed Uyghur separatism, really became repackaged as Uyghur terrorism or extremism. And this has been the norm since 2002, and it's the standard accusation. Looking at my data set, it's the widest accusation that's leveled against political activists. Many of these are Uyghur human rights activists, prominent figures, including Rabia Kadir and others who have been labeled as extremists by the Chinese state. This has created huge problems. It's also beyond just the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's also meant abuse of international systems such as Interpol, which is a global police collaborative framework. So really by issuing Interpol red notices, by flagging certain Uyghur activists as extremists, this has led to some detentions and even extraditions over time, including the ongoing case of Idris Hassan, who is now currently in Morocco in detention. And a recent extradition treaty signed with China may lead to his eventual extradition in this coming year. So with the methodologies, the use of international systems, China's also been using its United Front Work Department to pursue Uyghurs, particularly in democratic states, where it's been building contacts among the Uyghur diaspora community, create a sense of fear among them, where gather intelligence and information on communities, and also even intimidate, in certain cases, Uyghur activists who've been speaking on American university campuses and also Canadian university campuses. One of the components that's really made transnational repression different in its scale in the modern era is, of course, the rise of digital communications technologies. Of course, social media has granted a lot of influence for diaspora communities to have impact for their activism on their homelands. But this has also made them a more prominent target, of course. And increasingly, it's offered a series of tools through which authoritarian states can pursue dissidents on a scale that's unprecedented, and also gather information on them and offer new threat channels. So some of the strategies that we've seen since 2017, a mass escalation in them, I've documented over 5,000 instances in which Uyghurs report facing either cyber attacks, having malware downloaded. The Chinese state's becoming increasingly sophisticated. We're seeing platforms such as Facebook that were once safe for activists. There are now fake Uyghur language groups being formed, where people who are engaged in that community are clicking links shared by those false groups, and it's putting malware on their computers, which is leading to loss of information. It's also granting access to their computers to malicious actors, either Chinese state actors or state-aligned actors. Often, of course, it's difficult to determine. Part of the reason that transnational repression is so difficult to combat is because it's often in a gray area where we struggle to define what was a state actor and what is a state-aligned actor of some sort, or even just, in some instances, Chinese independent nationalists who are pursuing their own agendas, which oftentimes interlink with the interests of the state. So it's a very difficult area to monitor for these kinds of the incentives of the actors involved. It's by nature very murky studying transnational repression. Of course, we try to mitigate against this with the report by focusing on publicly reported cases, usually cases that have reached the international press, where they've been verified by journalists or by other actors such as Human Rights Watch or trusted organizations that monitor and deal with diaspora community activism. So this is tried really to, this just reduce the data set, of course, by focusing on these publicly available cases. I make sure to point out that the real scale of this may be significantly higher. Conversations I've had with diaspora activists, among diaspora communities themselves, has revealed that the scale is probably much larger, but many Uyghurs fear reporting, of course. The sense of fear among the community leads them to try to keep a low profile. Many are hesitant to speak with media for fear that this will draw unwarranted attention toward their family members, particularly those who have family residing within Xinjiang's borders. One thing that's always surprising for many media commentators, of course, is that a lot of the countries that are collaborating with China are Muslim majority countries. There's a lot of sense of why are Muslim majority countries not more sympathetic, so they say, to the Uyghur cause. But part of this is explained by, of course, many of these states are themselves repressive states that have tight controls on media. There's often a lack of information for the general public as to the level of collaboration. And of course, a lot of this topic's only really gaining traction the past year or so, the transnational component of that repression. So many populations are simply unaware, unable to hold their governments to account. And there's also a convergence of political and economic incentives, particularly in regions such as post-Soviet Central Asia, where we've seen a lot of efforts by states there to clamp down on information, which undermines their economic interests. Of course, Kazakhstan emerged in 2019 as a real window through which journalists and international media were gaining insight into the atrocities unfolding within Xinjiang, because many of the refugees had fled into Kazakhstan, where they were speaking with international press. This, of course, placed the Kazakh state in an uncomfortable position, largely because not only Uyghurs, but other Turkic minorities, including ethnic Kazakhs, have been detained within China's re-education centers. And this has placed a lot of pressure on regimes such as Kazakhstan's to negotiate with the Chinese state, where we've had some detainees released as a result, but of course, many remain imprisoned. So this political pressure was really what inspired this report. Was I grew interested in seeing this pattern across Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where there was this political component that was international dimension of the Xinjiang crisis. And I started to look into the data on how many Uyghurs had been detained in the past or extradited to China, sorry. And over time, I really studied the patterns of how this has evolved. So the first instance of deportations I've logged in this data set is from 1997, which was in Pakistan. This was in response to unrest, which has unfolded in southern Xinjiang in a town called Baran, in which there had been a small uprising and a subsequent crackdown by Chinese security services. Some of these had fled to Pakistan, where they were subsequently arrested in Pakistan and deported. 12 were deported in 1997, which is the first instance. From then, we really see a development where we see a lot more deportations from Pakistan, but also from neighboring Central Asia. As the Shanghai Cooperation Organization consolidated as a multilateral framework, there began to emerge a lot more patterns where Uyghur groups, even cultural groups, museums to Uyghur culture that didn't seem to display any political ambitions or any linkages really with the Uyghurs residing in Xinjiang, were shut down in places such as Uzbekistan and also Kazakhstan. So there was a tightening from the early 2000s on political activism or even apolitical cultural activism within Central Asia's borders. Over time, especially with the onset of the war on terror, China began to focus a lot more on South Asia. So Pakistan in particular, and also with Afghanistan, there was growing Chinese security service interference in the politics in those countries, the issuance of so-called terror lists by the Ministry of State Security, where these lists included human rights activists and people who'd been documented activists, some of whom had been deported from Pakistan and later executed. So these are well-documented cases of which war on terror rhetoric had really been abused and weaponized to target Uyghurs in particular outside China's borders. Then with 2009, there was a real shift. Of course, the unrest in Urumqi and the severe police crackdown in the aftermath resulted in what some scholars have identified as an exodus of some 30,000 Uyghurs beyond China's borders. So the diaspora community expanded dramatically in the aftermath of Urumqi, where now we had Uyghur refugee flows into Southeast Asia, a place where there had been small communities in the past, but this expanded. And as a result, we really saw cooperation with Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and even places such as Myanmar, where Uyghurs had fled and were deported. So really the transnational repression oriented with both the rise of China's economic presence in those countries, but also with the expansion of the diaspora community and the exodus. Many of these were trying to reach Turkey. Turkey remains, of course, the largest diaspora outside Central Asia, and it's still a major source of Uyghur population flows, and it still has a large and active base. And the Uyghurs in Turkey still have a unique role within Turkish politics. There's still a lot of sympathy for Uyghurs, and occasionally the Turkish state has even voiced concern about the developments within Xinjiang. But of course, as China's economic presence has grown in Turkey, and Turkey has become increasingly isolated due to its political positions, especially after the crackdown on the so-called Gulenist movement. The isolation of Turkey has led to deepening dependence on China, which has put a lot of pressure on the Uyghur community, particularly after Erdogan signed an extradition treaty, which is yet to be ratified by the Turkish parliament. This is a source of fear for many Uyghurs, and many I've spoke with who've since fled either to the United States, Canada, or the European Union have cited this looming extradition treaty as one of their motivations for moving. So safe havens of the past can no longer be deemed entirely safe. And this fear alone is enough to undermine a lot of activism, which is a component I'd like to emphasize with this research. That of course, the numbers are large in themselves. I've documented some 1,500 Uyghurs who've either been detained or deported from their place of residence, and some 5,000 or so cyber attacks or threats to family members. But for each one of these people who are targeted, of course, there are many countless others who've been silenced, who are now scared due to what happened, the sense of fear within that community, the psychological pressures and burdens. Many of these Uyghurs I've interviewed suffer from depression. They have anxiety, fear of what will happen to their family members, fear of their community. Many of them are no longer participating in community events. They're increasingly isolated due to fear of Chinese intelligence having infiltrated community centers. And this is a common pattern that I've documented around the world. So the numbers, large as they are, they're just part of the story. And I hope that this report, by weaving together stories of Uyghurs residing in far-flung places from Australia to the Middle East and to America, we really see commonalities of this fear and the depression and the sense of political isolation, which has struck the Uyghur community. And this is really what makes transnational repression such an important policy framework through which we have to combat. We need policies that can combat the reach of authoritarian states, particularly within the borders of democratic countries, but also within places where they previously felt safe. This is why we need to expand refugee quotas. We need to provide Uyghur language services through which diaspora activists can safely report instances or where they feel threatened or where they may have been threatened online. There needs to be clear channels through which they can be helped. We of course need the international community to continue to place pressure on activists or on state institutions which are participating in transnational repression and which are undermining democratic foundations, particularly the right to mobilize and the right to be active members of civil society. Transnational repression undermines this activism through its culture of fear that it permeates within the diaspora community. And Robert, I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Bradley. I'd like to go now to Omar Kanat, who has long lived the issues that Bradley has just described here in the United States and around the world. Mr. Kanat, thank you very much for joining us. We would love to hear your thoughts both on the report, but also on some of the issues that Bradley has touched on more broadly.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be on this panel. I would like to, of course, thank Bradley for working so closely with the Uyghur Human Rights Project and creating the Transnational Repression database and jointly publishing the research before the series of 4 joint reports by the Access Society and UHRP. UHRP also published 2 earlier reports on transnational repression in 2018 and in 2019, as well as a report in 2020 on the Chinese government's policy of intentionally making Uyghurs stateless by not renewing their passports. This report was called Weaponized Passports, the Cries of Uyghur Stateless. So here are some, I will give some examples of the kind of the intimidation and harassment gathered from UHRP's interviews with Uyghurs in the US, Canada, and published in August 2018. For example, China is using many tools, as Bradley mentioned, the WeChat, via WeChat, for example, people receive calls, a call WeChat to an Uyghur American man from an unknown contact, for example, who said he was a police officer in China. The police officer knew details about the Uyghur American. It's very surprising who he worked with, and even how much he earned in a week in the US. The police officer told the man that his parents were safe, but threatened that there were others who would imprison them unless he provided information to the Chinese authorities. So this is something common, I can say. Many people receive this kind of call in the US, in other European countries, from Chinese agents. A text message, for example, please don't be a disaster for your loved ones. You better think more about your family members. This is also messages that people are getting or receiving from Chinese agents. A voice email, for example, received by a camp survivor from her brother. How could you do this to your parents? The message said to us. What kind of daughter are you? You should go to the Chinese embassy right away and denounce all the things you said about the Chinese government in the interviews you gave to the Radio Free Asia, and tell them you love China. Tell them you were pressured by Uyghur organizations in the US to lie about your detention and torture in the camps, and take back everything you said. Otherwise, China can get you wherever you are. So a Uyghur Canadian, for example, posted on Twitter, I am getting continuous harassing calls from police in China. Today, I got a message threatening me to detain all my relatives and asking me to cooperate instead of harming them by my activities. It is very frustrating, leading to suicide thoughts. A comment from a student, all I wanted was to get my degree and go back to my homeland. My parents are suffering because of me. By breaking the silence, I am risking the life of my family members. A Uyghur American student described the student's fear of being reported to the Chinese officials. They are afraid of being reported by informants who could either be Uyghur or Chinese, and they essentially send their names back to the Chinese government, and the Chinese government questions their family members and then detains them or send them to the camps. The Uyghur American described what it is like to be contacted by Chinese state security agents. They are just telling us, we are watching you wherever you go. Still, you are a Chinese. Even though abroad, it doesn't mean they can't do something to you because they have your friends and your relatives. I can also illustrate the seriousness of the threat with some recent cases of deportation that UHRP has been involved in to try to rescue Uyghurs that the Chinese government was pursuing abroad. Turkestan had to leave Kazakhstan because authorities told her that they would not renew her residency permit. Only after she arrived in the US in September 2020, then she felt safe telling her full story to the BBC, with the first independent confirmation of systematic rape in the camps. So there are a lot of people in different part of the world, Uyghurs, who spend some time in the camps, and they want to tell their story, but they don't feel safe. So therefore, they told us that they cannot be public because of fear that they don't feel safe. So if they arrive a safe place or safety, reach safety, then they will tell their story. And there are recent cases, for example, as Bradley mentioned, a case in Morocco, Idris Hassan facing the deportation to China. There are also cases in Saudi Arabia. 4 Uyghurs in Saudi Arabia are in the risk of being deported back to China. Next, I would like to say something about the policy responses. In August last year, federal law enforcement officially recognized the transnational repression of Uyghurs in the US as a crime. The FBI issued a public statement in August 2021 in response to our concerns. The title was Chinese Government's Transnational Repression Violates US Laws and Youth-Based Uyghurs' Rights. The bulletin is the first public response by the FBI to Uyghurs, called for the rights of Uyghur Americans to be recognized as a priority for U.S. law enforcement agencies. In line with 2 reports published by UHRP, it states that the Chinese government's actions target Uyghurs. The Chinese government's actions are illegal and violate Uyghurs' rights. The Chinese government acts on American soil to silence dissent, issue instructions, collect information, and compel compliance. Uyghurs receive threats digitally and in person. Uyghur American family members in East Turkestan routinely suffer retaliation. The State Department is also stepping up action. Finally, on March 22 this year, the State Department announced it imposed visa restrictions on PRC officials who are responsible for repressive policies targeting religious and spiritual protectioners, members of ethnic minority groups, human rights defenders outside China's borders. These are the first sanctions imposed in response to the Great Wall of Steel policies. We believe that much more can be done by the State Department. Finally, we are also happy to see the Department of Justice step up persecution of these crimes. On March 16, the Department of Justice announced the persecution of several individuals working for the Ministry of State Security who committed crimes on US soil. Here are some, I can make it shorter. In some, the UHRP's research and Bradley's research has shown repeatedly over the past 5 years that we are not safe from harassment and intimidation abroad, even in the US soil. Every single Uyghur in the diaspora has been subject to this kind of international, transnational repression, even in democratic countries. It is time for action. We hope that the State Department and the Department of Justice will not stop here, but will take further action to end these violations. Thank you.
Thank you. Bradley, I'd like to ask a question that you treat at some length in your report, although you didn't mention it today, but I know that it's something you've been concerned about right along. And this is a very Wilson Center question, which is, what about the Chinese government point of view? You mentioned, and what about its motivations? You mentioned what the Chinese government calls the 3 evils: terrorism, separatism, extremism. And of course, even prior to talking about the 3 evils, the Chinese government had a series of policies for non-Han minority peoples living in border regions like Xinjiang and Tibet. Could you tell us what China thinks it gains by treating the Uyghurs the way that they have? It certainly costs China a tremendous amount reputationally, internationally. Excuse me. Does China really believe that all of its critics are terrorists? How should we view this as Americans, remembering that during the War on Terror, which you cited, we went after people around the world that we deemed to be terrorists, some of whom are still in Guantanamo, some of whom are Uyghurs. So how do you frame this with light of China's own security policies, its ethnic policies? What would be the Chinese response to your study, and what would be your response to that, if I might? Thank you. You're muted, Bradley.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Of course, the global war on terror became a very important rhetorical framework through which China's really began to reframe its position within Xinjiang. Of course, it had a long decades of persecution of activists and so on, usually with the label of separatist. China's always framed it that there was a separatist or an insurgent movement of some sort active among Uyghurs, or that Xinjiang was uniquely unstable, or that it was being manipulated first by the Soviet Union at the height of the Sino-Soviet split. There was a lot of concern among the Chinese side about Soviet interference in the region to destabilize it or to undermine China. And from 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it really became part of the great power competition framework between the US and China, where there was fears of external interference. So of course, from the Chinese point of view, of course, there's been a long legacy with the century of humiliation rhetoric and so on about colonialism and about the interference within what China perceives to be its territory. But of course, the problem with Xinjiang is that it's a region that has not been neatly integrated within the Chinese states throughout history. Of course, in documents issued by China, Xinjiang will be framed as having been part of a Chinese state since at least the Han Dynasty. Of course, this has not really been integrated within a state project really until 1884, when it was incorporated within the Qing Dynasty. So Chinese presence in the region, or Chinese role, is really quite a modern concept. Of course, the collapse of the Qing Dynasty into now a nation state, which we know today is the People's Republic of China, it's of course become increasingly difficult to integrate minority regions as we get to Xi Jinping, where we have more of a Han sense of Chinese nationalism. Of course, minority populated regions, not just Xinjiang, but of course Tibet and also Inner Mongolia and others, there's been attempts to reposition them within this new sense of Chinese nationalism, but they haven't fit comfortably within it. So oftentimes this fear, what should be emphasized is that territorially speaking, with the People's Republic of China, the majority of land is part of autonomous regions or minority regions. So there is this sense of insecurity in the sense that these regions being populated by people of non-Han descent, that they are therefore seen as dubious or potential collaborators with enemies of China. This is the framework which a lot of Chinese nationalists tend to refract the Uyghur issue. Now, of course, with terrorism, these long struggles became repackaged as part of a campaign against global terror. And of course, there are legitimate concerns about terrorism, just as there are around other parts of the world. And there have been attacks on Chinese Belt and Road infrastructure, particularly in Pakistan. But none of these have been attributed to Uyghurs. They're often offshoots of the Taliban and other movements. So there's been no real evidence of any Uyghur terror insurgency. And of course, attacks that have been taking place, and which we condemn, including the 2014 Kunming attacks, many of these attacks can be seen as desperation in response to the repressive environment in Xinjiang, the lack of cultural autonomy, the inability to to express oneself or even engage in economic development. So China's been pursuing what many scholars have framed the term of settler colonial economic development in the region, whereby organizations such as the paramilitary Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps control much of the agricultural and economic lands of Xinjiang. Often Uyghurs are excluded from working within these areas, and it's led to massive economic disparities between the Uyghur population and the Han population. And this has really created a lot of unrest, a lot of resentment. Think of this in the way that we think about debates around gentrification in the West and how this impacts local communities. This is on a mass scale within an entire region. So these tensions around the economic development, often it's seen as not serving the well-being of the community or the people who've resided there for decades. And so this sense of vulnerability through the development, which China is re-emphasizing, a lot of its current documents that have been leaked in recent years have really shown that they're doubling down on increasing Han quotas of in-migration into the region. And of course, more horrifyingly, there's been attempts to interfere with Uyghur population and birth rates. Birth rates have declined dramatically, of course, with mass incarceration, but also reports of forced sterilization and far more direct atrocities that are taking place within Xinjiang. So this is all part to re-engineer the demographic balance, to re-establish, due to the nationalist ideology that's taking root within the Chinese Communist Party, that only Han Chinese can be trusted to govern in certain regions. So this has led to a reversal of Maoist era policies of at least having some form of representation. Of course, this is expressed through even the name of the region itself, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but any sense of autonomy has certainly been stripped away, if it ever truly existed. The war on terror has, of course, reinforced a lot of this because, as scholars such as Sean Roberts have pointed out, it's really created a rhetoric through which we can dehumanize activists. We can, rather than view legitimate concerns around Uyghur integration within society, the right to pursue Uyghur culture, refracted through the lens of terrorism, it creates this dehumanizing almost sense of having no legitimate grievance. It delegitimizes a cause, and it instills a sense of violence toward civilians. It's not necessarily present. Really, some of the main violence has grown in response to, after the mass crackdowns with the Urumqi riots of 2009 and the security crackdown leading into 2010, and of course atrocities including mass disappearances of young Uyghur youth in particular. Not only did some Uyghurs flee the country, the 30,000 or so that I mentioned before, but there are also a large number who are increasingly disgruntled. When you start to look at the data around attacks that the Chinese state's framed as terror attacks, you really see that there are tense standoffs almost, with typical of having a security state heavily armed interfering in local customs. So for example, you see incidents of weddings where Chinese police have forcibly removed the veil of the bride, and this has sparked fights which have descended into violence. And this is then refracted as a terrorist attack when really it's an atrocity that's taking place due to a tense security environment. It's not a premeditated attack. There's no real evidence of external linkages to international terror organizations until recent years with the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is a very small scale movement which offshoot from Afghanistan, which has shown up in the Syrian civil war conflict. But the operational capabilities of TIP, the Turkestan Islamic Party, to operate within Chinese borders, they have not really been proven. And even any connections to attacks on Chinese Belt and Road infrastructure in other countries and other jurisdictions, they're very tenuous at best links to any form of TIP international terrorism. In fact, China is more vulnerable to the same terrorist organizations which the US and other countries are suffering from, including the Pakistani Taliban. So rather than having a sophisticated counter-terror approach that takes a more broad look at the real threat tangents towards Chinese infrastructure or Chinese nationals overseas, oftentimes you see this heavy-handed emphasis on Uyghur groups, which actually leads to short-sighted policies. This particular in Pakistan, where there's a constant pursuit of Uyghur groups. Pakistani security services often pursue them to the detriment of pursuing other groups that pose a larger threat to Chinese nationals. So I think the Chinese counter-terror strategies have become very narrow in their focus and fixated on these very domestically oriented goals that's left China quite vulnerable to the much larger threat.
Well, thank you. We're talking about Bradley Jardine's new report, Great Wall of Steel, China's global campaign to suppress the Uyghurs. If members of our audience would like to ask questions, please send them to us at china@wilsoncenter.org. That's china@wilsoncenter.org. Mr. Knott, I wanted to give you a response, an opportunity to respond to what Bradley has just said, and in particular, if you have anything to add on what you understand to be Beijing's motives. I think Bradley's report demonstrates that Americans, while we've tended to think of the Uyghur issue as being about re-education camps and forced labor, there is this other aspect to it, which is an international dragnet that is looking to silence Uyghur critics of the regime worldwide. Why does China feel compelled to do this despite its reputational cost? If we maybe hear from you, and then we've been joined now by Nuri Turkel. Mr. Turkel, great to see you. We'll get to you in just a minute, but I'd like to give Omar Kanat first an opportunity to respond.
Yes, of course, this Chinese government, first of all, use this terror. Bradley explained it very perfectly how China is using this, has been using the war and terror and extremism and radicalism slogans to suppress the Uyghurs at home and abroad. So they are they use this security or separatism to securitize the situation in Uyghur region in order to garner the support of the Chinese public into this situation. So now, because of this Chinese government's securitizing the situation and using this, accusing Uyghurs as terrorists or separatists, now the large portion of the Chinese public, Chinese population are supporting what the Chinese government has been doing to the Uyghurs in the Uyghur region, even supporting this genocide against the Uyghur people. And they think that the Uyghurs deserve this because Uyghurs are trying to separate a part of China. So this is what the Chinese government actually achieved in this. And also it is cooperating with this, with the Central Asian government using extremism, radicalism, because the Central Asian governments are afraid of spread of radicalism, extremism. So Chinese government use this as to suppress the Uyghurs in Central Asia, because there is a large Uyghur diaspora in Central Asia. China is afraid that these Uyghurs will join the Uyghur movement and will work to support the Uyghurs in order to prevent their support for the Uyghur movement in diaspora. The Chinese government used their slogans and achieved a lot of things and actually suppressed the Uyghur movement with the help and cooperation of the Central Asian governments. So now, not a single Uyghur activist can travel to Central Asia. I myself was stopped by Kazakh border officials in 2010. I wanted to visit Kazakhstan in 2010, and I traveled from Istanbul to Almaty, and I was stopped at the Almaty airport and interrogated by the Kazakh security agents, and they asked me why I'm coming to Central Asia, what is my purpose of my visit. Although I said I want to visit my friends because I have a lot of friends, even relatives in Kazakhstan, they told me that you are not allowed to enter any of the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations. So then actually they didn't allow me to enter, and I had to return. They deported me actually back to Turkey. So I'm a Turkish citizen, and I was deported back from this border from Kazakhstan to Turkey. So they have been using these slogans to show the world, first of all, to Western world that they are fighting, the Chinese government fighting the same enemy. Actually, it is not the same enemy. Uyghurs doesn't have anything to do with separatism, with radicalism, extremism, and the Chinese government has been using this, global war and terror as well to suppress Uyghur further. So if you a few weeks before, for example, 9/11 terrorist attack, actually the Xinjiang government published a report and asked the investors in the West to invest in Uyghur region, and they said that in this announcement statement that the Uyghur region was safe and stable, and it is they are welcoming the investment or Western investors. But after a few weeks, after 9/11 terrorist attack, suddenly Chinese government issued another report and telling the world that they also face the same terror threat that Western governments, the US, is facing. So and use this war on terror to execute hundreds of people, to detain tens of thousands of Uyghurs, accusing them having some kind of association with terrorism. Even writers, poets, religious leaders, very peaceful religious leaders, ordinary people who complained about Chinese government's policies very peacefully were rounded up and accused have some association with international terrorist organizations.
Thank you. Bradley's report, if you would like to read it, is available via a link on the Wilson Center webpage, at which most of the audience is watching this report. Also, if you look at the Books at Wilson page, you'll find a link also to The Great Wall of Steel. It will be coming out in hardback any minute now, but it's already available online. You can read it there. Again, if you have a question, please send it to us at china@wilsoncenter.org. Now I would like to go to Mr. Nuri Turkel, who I introduced earlier in the program. Nuri, you spend an awful lot of time with American policymakers talking about these issues. We will be making this publication available to a lot of policymakers as well as to staffers up on Capitol Hill. When you meet with members of Congress or members of the administration, what is it that you want them to understand about how the Uyghurs are being treated, and what are you asking them to do? What do you think are the right policy approaches for the United States?
First of all, Robert, thank you so much for convening this event. I wanted to extend also my gratitude, appreciation to Bradley for this report. It's not easy. It requires a lot of time and energy to do anything in this nature, especially when you deal with a country that is completely locked up. No media access, no individuals on the ground could even if they're willing to talk to researchers like yourself. So it's a tremendous work. As somebody who co-founded the Uyghur Human Rights Project, I do know how difficult it is to engage in thorough research and documentation. As for Robert's question, the number of things that we have been involved in advocating and educating Congress. Number one, the issue recognition. As Ömer Kanat pointed out, the type of extremism and terrorism that the United States has been fighting since 9/11 is not the same type of extremism that the China is trying to make our government, our policymakers, our Congress to believe. Secretary Blinken answered this question very well in his 60 Minutes interview that, you know, the United States and China don't see eye to eye when it comes to this issue. The other thing, in addition to the recognition, we've been advocating that this should be not only bipartisan, nonpartisan issue, because it goes to the heart of American value, American history, you know, some of the lessons that we learned, for example, never again. If that means anything, that this kind of atrocities should not be tolerated. And then the third, we've been advocating and also communicating to Congress and policymakers that this is not a typical human rights crisis that the world has known, or the American people have known, or some people feel indifferent. This is related to every aspect of our life: technology, supply chain, moral obligation, treaty obligation, foreign policy objectives, both bilateral and multilateral, and also US national security interest. When a government signs on an international treaty such as the Genocide Convention, it comes with an obligation. So those people who are critical of both Trump administration and Biden administration have to recognize that it is our treaty obligation to call it out when we see atrocities in this nature. The world has not seen anything like it since the Nazi era. That's the fact. And then the third is, this is also in the American people's, American US government's economic interest. Everything that you touch, all the way from PPEs that our fellow Americans used to protect their lives during the pandemic, to solar panels that you put on your roof to conserve energy, all relates to Uyghur people. Actually, American people not only have not done enough, but also in a way financing this ongoing genocide in China. So that is why this is also in the interest of US economic interest. And finally, you know, we cannot use human rights or chant human rights slogans or raise human rights concerns when it's politically expedient, and then push it to the side when it's politically not convenient for us. So we have to be coherent. We have to be consistent. And US is in the best position to show a leadership it has been in the past. And then the last piece that I personally been advocating is that this should not be the matter only for the United States government to address. Specifically those European allies, like-minded governments who have firsthand experience experiencing Nazi Germany, fascism, even communism in China, in Europe, should know how this kind of atrocious behaviors, policies end. So no politician, no business leader, no elites, no policy expert can no longer look the other way, thinking that this is another human rights concern.
Okay, thank you. Let's go now to some listener questions. And I'll put this first one, maybe Bradley, you can start, but if either of the other two of you would like to comment on it, please do so. Could you discuss the persecution of ethnic Kazakhs? That means both within China and outside of China's borders. Did you find any distinction between the situations of Kazakhs and Uyghurs? Does the Kazakh government advocacy help ethnic Kazakhs? We've been focused so far in this discussion, of course, on the plight of the Uyghurs, but it's not only Uyghurs. There are other groups and subgroups. Bradley first, and then either of the other two of you. You're muted.
Thank you for that question. I found no distinction in how these groups are treated. They are still interned within camps. They receive the same isolation, social ostracism as Uyghur population more broadly. Of course, this has created diplomatic backlash, especially with Kazakhstan, where there have been some small-scale protests that have been going on for years outside the Chinese consulate against it's really relating to Kazakhs in Kazakhstan who have family members who may have been detained in the camps, or even some who are angry about the border restrictions and closures, which have prevented them from going across either to visit family or to engage in economic activity across the border. The Kazakh government, of course, has been placed in a very difficult position where it's balancing domestic stability or ensuring that such protests or being seen as being colluding with China in this repression against Kazakhs doesn't interfere with their ability to extract rent and revenue from China as a major investor and trade partner, and even a security provider increasingly. So really what's happened is the Kazakh government has done some backdoor negotiations, which has seen some small scales of releases of prisoners from Xinjiang who've been relocated to Kazakhstan. Even just this past week, there's been an agreement that's been reached between Chinese authorities and the Kazakh government for 100 Kazakhs to be re-released within Kazakhstan under the agreement that these individuals don't speak to the international media about their experiences in the camps. So even today, there are still small-scale agreements taking place between the two governments. So far, we know of 20 who have already been relocated, but the quota that was given was 100. So we need to see to what extent that will be supported or it will continue. In addition to that, really, the situation, although Kazakhstan has, of course, been placed in this difficult position of where it is trying to negotiate to some extent, it's also been repressive, cracking down on activists who've been attempting to draw international attention to the crisis within Xinjiang. We've seen reporters connected and researchers connected with the Xinjiang Victims Database, which is one of the major repositories of witness testimonies and original accounts of life within the camps. Some researchers who've been based in Almaty in Kazakhstan have been denied visas, which have prevented them from returning to the country to conduct their research. Others, such as Serikjan Balash, the state accused him of terrorism for his activism for the Atatürk movement, which was documenting victim accounts within Kazakhstan's borders. He subsequently fled to Turkey and is now based within the United States. So of course, pressure continues to be applied to such activists. And Kazakh political police brutality is definitely exercised more frequently against any protests which have an anti-China component than for other issues. So this really shows how sensitive the China factor is within Kazakh politics, and Kazakh officials being smeared as colluding in the repression of ethnic Kazakhs within a growing nationalist domestic environment is becoming an increasingly risky political factor, which is only intensifying crackdowns on anyone who's advocating for human rights on behalf of ethnic Kazakhs or ethnic Uyghurs.
Omer and Nuri, we have a question about an important aspect of these issues that we haven't touched on yet, and that is education. I'll read the question, and then if I could ask you each to respond. Is all or almost all education, elementary through high school and college, in Xinjiang conducted in Mandarin, including in Uyghur majority rural communities? If so, is this a recent change, or is education still carried on in both Mandarin and Uyghur? What are the trends here for the language of education? That's question one about education. Question two, also about education. What impact has China's post-2009 policy had on China's traditional approach of trying to co-opt national ethnic groups by training them, a number of college students, in so-called national minority schools like the Minzu Xueyuan, or mainstreaming them into Chinese educational facilities, such as national level elite universities? During a 2013 trip to China, the questioner writes, I was told that in Shanghai universities, Uyghur students live a rather isolated existence. So in education within Xinjiang, what language are they learning, and how are Uyghurs who go on to university in China being treated or categorized within that university system? Maybe we'll go to Omar and then Nuri.
Yes, before I respond to this question, my response to this question, I just want to add what Bradley said about the Kazakhs. So I agree, generally agree with him, but the Kazakh government, as Bradley also indicated, played an important role, I think, with silent diplomacy. They contacted the Chinese government, and because of this diplomatic activities, many Kazakhs were released from the camps, and there are I can say there are thousands of Kazakhs who were released from the camps now in Kazakhstan. We have a project now. We started a project with the Atajurt to interview some of them, because they are so frustrated, because nobody listened to them, and nobody care about what they went through in these camps. So they want to tell their story. They want to expose what happened to them and what they went through in these concentration camps. Yes, to answer your question, there is no, the Chinese government, of course, they started a bilingual education years ago, but it doesn't exist anymore. There is a monolingual education. Since actually it started in September 2016 in Khotan. The Chinese government totally removed the Uyghur instructions at school, and then they expanded to the whole country. But now no Uyghur schools are existed in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. No, even the authors are not allowed to publish books in Uyghur. They are allowed only to translate Chinese books into Uyghur. So this is what's happening. So in 2013, we cannot compare the situation, present situation, with the situation in 2013. 2013 was generally the more, in comparison to today, is more, there were some, even there were Uyghur schools, and people could travel. Some Uyghurs could manage to travel to the outside world, and there were communications between people in the Uyghur region and their relatives and friends in abroad. But since 2017, all the communication has been cut. We don't have, most of us don't have any communication whatsoever with our loved ones, with our relatives back home. So this is a total different world now in Uyghur region.
Thank you, Nuri. Anything to add on the educational front?
Yeah, well, I actually have, I just completed a book project that will be published shortly. The name of the project, the book, the title is No Escape. I profiled everything that I've experienced in my entire life. That includes this educational system that I was subjected to. As somebody who was born and raised in Kashgar, I was allowed to enroll in Uyghur language school back then. But the Han Chinese language wasn't optional. It was part of the curriculum, but no one forced me or pointing me or threatening me with the consequences of not picking up that language or picking up that culture. It was fine. I intentionally or by my own will spent a lot of time studying the language. But to this day, I'm very comfortable reading, listening, speaking. That was how I was educated. And then the second piece of the question, I have also experienced studying in inland China among the Han Chinese students, being a part of the Uyghur class. So you're right, citing that description in 2013. Even then, we were kind of isolated. We had our own cafeteria, even our own corner, even separate classes. Sometimes professors even say kind of condescending things like, "Oh, you guys cannot handle too much class, so we have to reduce the curriculum." That sort of attitude. But since 2009, even earlier, UHRP did a report on the language. China's compulsory bilingual education, as Umer said, is essentially monolingual education. So they just completely wipe out the Uyghur language from the education. The textbooks. In 2009 was a turning point. I interacted with individuals, the Uyghurs who came here, who were born after 1990s, after 2000, like part of that educational system. I even sometimes feel strange that I need to use translator to communicate with them, with my own Uyghur contacts, which was very disturbing. Not only that, I sense cultural difference. I had cultural shock when I was communicating with them because they're so like they sound like they look very European, Euro-Asian, but at the same time, the way they interact, the thought process is very much like those Chinese students that I went to school with. So it was very disturbing. That was very concerning. Why do I say this? Even without putting millions of Uyghurs through this quote unquote transformation process, which is a code word for human reengineering, Uyghurs already picked up that language. Uyghurs already were okay with that compulsory monolingual education just for the purposes of survival. The Chinese did not have to do this. Chinese did not have to lock up millions of people under the guise of re-educating. Re-educating what? Re-educating university professors, authors who are already fluent in Chinese language? That is the most bizarre aspect of what the Chinese government has done. And the other interesting piece, this has a historical relevance. Like if you look back to history, whether it be how Stalin treated non-Russian population or how Nazi Germany treated the Jews and the Romas, they attacked the social elites, intellectuals, the authors who are custodian of ethno-cultural heritage. That's precisely what happened. It started with the language, and then they took away the professors. The Xinjiang University president, who has PhD, an honorary degree from Japan, from France, now is languishing in prison. What is his crime? He committed two-faced. He was identified as two-faced official. One person at home, adhering, cherishing his own language, cultural heritage, and then the outside, he was kind of echoing the Chinese government lines. That was not even enough.
Okay, again, for members of our audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please write to us at china@wilsoncenter.org. There's another question for the group. Could you elaborate on the relations between the Taliban and the Turkestan Islamic Party and how relations between them shape the relations between Afghanistan and China in the short and medium term? So, of this group, Turkestan Islamic Party, any relations with the Taliban? Is there anything that we need to know about that? Any one of the three.
I think Bradley explained it very well. So, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, historically, of course, there was a small contingent known as the East Turkestan Islamic Party that took root in northern Afghanistan in the 1990s. This group had very tenuous links to the Taliban. Reporting had suggested, as well, great reporting by Omar himself from Afghanistan at the time, that they may have been allowed access to Afghanistan, really to give as strategic bargaining power, if necessary, for part of geopolitical bargaining between the Taliban and China. But really they were a marginal, very small group and really disbanded by the end of the 90s, where many of them were actually brought to Kabul, where they were placed under surveillance by the Taliban government. So they weren't even allowed to be active within Afghanistan's borders. Over time, some of these fled. With the onset of the war on terror, any remaining contingents fled or were brought into the Taliban's ranks, reportedly to fight, and died in conflict. Others had fled to Pakistan, where there've been small-scale group ever since. That on the lead up to the Beijing Olympics of 2008, around 2006, another group emerged called the Turkistan Islamic Party, which claims to be a successor organization, but it's very loosely affiliated. It has very few members of the original grouping. It's really risen to more prominence of late because of its another offshoot from that group, which really emerged in Syria. The Syrian civil war has set up communities in northern Syria, where there have been some fighters who took part in major battles in the Syrian conflict, but they have increasingly less links to the original Afghan-based group. Today, with the Taliban, there's been increasing Taliban crackdowns on Uyghur communities, not only those who are connected with these offshoot groups, but just the wider Afghan diaspora of some 2,000 Uyghurs. But in terms of links with the Taliban, neighboring Tajikistan, for example, its intelligence has reported that the Taliban's disbanded some of the final remaining small groups affiliated with Turkestan Islamic Party from the Wakhan corridor area, which is the only border with China. It's a very small land border that China has with Afghanistan. There have been reports of Taliban activities there, working on behalf in collaboration with China to seal that off and close down any remaining fighter cells. So really, relations with the Taliban are extremely fraught and complex, and the Taliban is really operating from a position of realpolitik to gain more investments from China and probably keep small-scale contingents for future bargaining if it needs to place pressure on China. But I think we should see these as manipulations rather than overt or ideological support of any sort.
Yes,
yes, please, Omer, yes.
Yeah, I think that even in the first, when the Taliban took over the Afghanistan, ruled Afghanistan in 1996, they had, some relation with China. Even Chinese ambassador in Pakistan visited Kandahar and met with Mullah Umar, and they made some agreement on, and the Taliban government at the time, Taliban foreign minister, Mutawakkil, made a statement and gave a guarantee to China that no one can use the Afghan territory to do anything, to do any activities against the Chinese government. And as Bradley said, there are now Uyghur community in Afghanistan. They are in fear, from the Taliban. Even they are now being considered by many human rights organizations as vulnerable population in Afghanistan. So they are trying to get them out of Afghanistan, which ruled by Taliban. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to give each of you a chance to state any closing messages you may have for our audience members, either policy recommendations or what you would like them to pay attention to going forward. And maybe if we'd go in reverse order, Nuri and then Omer and then Bradley. Any final thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you. Robert, I forgot to mention that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, even though I'm sitting in front of a US government banner. Even, most of the stuff that I've been saying has been part of our policy recommendations to the US government. I would start with this. We have two legislative mandates. The first one is the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. signed into law by President Trump. We also have Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act signed into law by President Biden. We have other laws in the United States that have not been fully implemented, but these two laws must be fully implemented. The first law is very important, relates to today's discussion, transnational repression. The US law enforcement, the FBI, must investigate and enforce this law to explain to American people that we have our government's backing. And I should not live in fear of the Chinese reprisal while being a US citizen and while being a US official. This sentiment is shared by a broad Uyghur community in the United States. That's one piece. The other piece is that also relates to this particular legislative mandate, that we should also expand the targeted sanctions to the network of those officials and entities that are responsible for these egregious crimes against humanity and a genocide that is in its 6th year. And then move on to the other piece of legislation. American consumers have a lot at stake because of historical reasons, because of economical reasons, because of the moral reasons. American public should should demand our government to enforce the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act so that our supply chain will be free of tainted consumer products made by fellow human beings. And then the third, I caution those in various corridors of the US government think tank. I'm also a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. We talk about this a lot. We need to get ourselves freed from this notion that if we tone down our human rights, Xi Jinping or CCP will do X, Y, Z. It does not work. Robert, you're an expert in Chinese politics. It does not work. They do what is best for them. It's not because our special envoy for climate or someone asking them to take a responsible position, it does not work that. The question is this going to help them? If it did help them or helps them in the future, CCP will take an action. So this kind of conversation needs to be put on the back burner. We need to be realistic. This is the genocidal regime that we're dealing with. Business cannot go as usual. And finally, I will say this: American people have shown already their power during the Winter Olympics. The NBC viewership dropped almost half. So when American people speaks out, the business boardrooms, the corporate boardrooms will listen, our politicians will listen, and then those who are trying to spin and try to normalize the Chinese behavior will listen. So we need to stop treating this issue as another human rights concern, as I pointed out earlier. This is about us. This is about what kind of future that we will want.
Omar.
Yes, in this transnational repression is going on. In the US, for example, in the US, there are about 10,000 Uyghurs. Only a few dozen Uyghurs are now have been speaking up and advocating on behalf of their relatives back home. The rest are silent because they are afraid, they are under pressure, and they are scared that the Chinese government will retaliate. Maybe the Chinese government already use their relatives back home to silence these people. As I said, still Chinese agents keep calling the Uyghur Americans without stop. You know, they are calling Uyghur Americans and threatening them and harassing them, and then asking them to stay silent, or using their relatives back home as hostage and let them talk, call their relatives back home. So this is the situation. Even Uyghur activists are not free in anywhere of the world because of Chinese government's transnational repression. I returned from a trip to Malaysia in Indonesia. Even in Malaysia, in Malaysia especially, the Chinese agents were so active, they were following us. We were informed that we were following followed by the Chinese agents, and they had to, take some actions to protect us. So we are very grateful for the State Department and Department of Justice for taking the first step to address this problem, and also FBI for this bulletin. But there should be an international recognition of this, that this is a human rights violation, and there should be some international action to stop these kind of, transnational repression.
Thank you. Bradley Jardine.
Thank you. I'll just make a short remark because I realize we're short on time. I just wanted to speak to the need to protect Uyghurs who are already in vulnerable communities, particularly states that have deepening economic and security ties with China. Because Chinese influence is set to grow. One avenue that I've looked at where cooperation is most high with transnational repression is states which trade arms with China. I would caution that with the ongoing conflict with Ukraine, we're really seeing Russia stunted in its capacity to export arms to certain target areas, such as Central Asia, where it's historically had a strong presence. And this vacuum may be filled with more Chinese exports, especially in the Middle East as well, where it's already growing as an international arms and security provider. I think this will create a lot more space for China to exert leverage in areas where its leverage has already been growing. This will have negative repercussions for Uyghurs. This also has economic impact. China will likely fill that vacuum, particularly post-Soviet Central Asia, where that process already seems to be taking place. I think there needs to be more recognition of the long-term threats to Uyghur communities within such jurisdictions. There needs to be more quotas and provisions within the West and within allied states to resettle many Uyghurs who may be increasingly threatened in these countries.
Bradley, thank you for your report and for all that you've done here at Wilson over the past few years. Omar Kanat, Nuri Turkle, thank you for joining us and lending us your expertise today. And also behind the scenes, I want to thank Trian Burgess, Tracy Fitzgerald, and Ray Jung, who have made today's program possible. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we hope to see you again soon, at least virtually, at the Wilson Center.
Thank you.
Thank you.